So my job today is to have the pleasure of introducing our first speaker, or both of our speakers. But first off, we have Becky Rosenberg. So Becky is a doctoral candidate at King's College London in the French department. Her thesis examines the intersections of autofiction and autopathography to represent psychological suffering in the life writing of the Francophone writers Chloé Delhomme, Nelly Arcan, Linda Leach, and Chadot Javan. She has had ongoing research published in the online Journal of the Society for Francophone Postcolonial Studies, and recently had a chapter published in Narratives of the Therapeutic Encounter, Psychoanalysis, Talking Therapies, and Creative Practice. She worked for 2 years at the University of Nantes in France as a lectrice d'anglais and vacataire English instructor for 2 years prior to starting her doctoral research. She works part-time as a tutor and for the Brilliant Club as a tutor mentor. And today, Becky will be presenting for her paper, Writing the Psychiatric Hospital in Lindalé's Voix, une Crise, and Lettre, Morte. So thank you, Becky.
Thanks, Jemima, for that intro. Can I just check that everyone can hear me and can see my screen? No, not my embarrassing online shopping or anything like that. Okay, good. So I changed my title a little bit just because I ended up writing a bit too much, so I had to make a bit of a cut. So I'll be talking about psychiatric hospital in Voix, therapeutic encounters and psychological disturbances in Voix une Crise predominantly, and then a little bit in Lettre Morte towards the end. So these are sort of broadly some of the themes of my thesis, examining the autofictions, like I said, like Jemima said in the intro, of Lay, Nelly Arcan, Chloé Delhomme, and Chadot Javan. And this paper will be a kind of an overview touching on some of the key sections of Voix une Crise, and I'll, like I said, gesture towards Lettre Morte towards the end. So to begin with, I'll give an overview of Lay's biography and some of the key motifs of her, or motives, I guess, of her corpus. Much like other autofiction writers, she has a series of themes that she returns to again and again and explores throughout her works. She was born in Dalton in Vietnam in 1963 to a French mother and Vietnamese father. Oh, sorry, I've just got to apologise. I've got a bit of a prima donna for a dog, and he might hear him in the background, but hopefully it'll be okay. Anyway, so in 1968, Lay's family had to relocate due to North Vietnamese troops moving into South Vietnam, eventually settling in Saigon. Once there, Lay's life did not settle. She describes in an interview with Catherine Algon, and I have to apologise now because I forgot to do English translations, but I'll do my best to kind of do them as we go along. But basically, she found that her life didn't settle, and it proved to be a very kind of tempestuous, quite chaotic existence in Saigon. And there was a rupture, she calls it a rupture in childhood innocence, and a shift towards a kind of deterministic fatalism, which we see at the end of this quotation, where she says that from this moment when they moved to Saigon, the fall, the descent happened. And these kind of themes of kind of fatalism and this la chute, the fall, are kind of core themes that colour Lay's writing. Her works are frequently macabre and gory, with nightmares and visions featuring corpses, amputated limbs and spectres. In the same interview with Algon, she goes on to talk about how she has a sort of attraction towards sort of these sort of slightly macabre beings. And in addition to these more Gothic references, Lay's corpus explores the affects and pain of exile, dislocation from family and home country, and this entre-deux, or between two status of being both French and Vietnamese. Works such as Les Aubes and Héroïne explore the isolation and depression that can ensue with such cultural dislocation and rootlessness from the perspective of characters born in Vietnam or of Vietnamese descent living in France. The autofictional aspects of Lay's works are thus undeniable, with her autobiography kind of refracting through her various characters. This can be seen clearly in the representation of fathers throughout her corpus. Lay's own father stayed in Vietnam when Lay, her mother, and 3 sisters eventually moved from Saigon to Le Havre in 1977. In the same Algon interview, Lay writes of the close epistolary connection she had with her father and the enormous grief when he died in Vietnam in 1995. The figure of the abandoned father and the abandoned home country are core motifs in Leigh's text, made more visceral by the biographical knowledge that Leigh had not seen her father, did not see her father between her moving from Saigon to France and then his death in the mid-1990s. The reason why this biographical information is significant is because Leigh started writing a triptych of autofictional texts about psychological suffering or madness in kind of a broad sense, cultural sense, rather than in a pathological sense, and grief following the death of her father. In the Algon interview, which you see the second quotation on the screen now, she describes this period as follows: "I was suffering from hallucinations, suicidal thoughts, and paranoid behaviors." She was also hospitalized during this period, a clear point of autobiographical reference for Voix, Crise, which opens in an unnamed psychiatric hospital. Leigh writes about her hospitalization and alludes to the observations taken from this experience. She says here, "I became the spectator of the madness of others, a very kind of talkative madness, since the women were there with me, always expressing themselves a lot." This emphasis on talking can be seen in Voix une Crise, even in the title Voix, Voices, with the opening pages filled with the overlapping, often unpunctuated speech of numerous women in the corridor of the hospital. This 2-year period of grief and suffering culminated in Leigh writing the first of her loose trilogy or triptych entitled Trois Parcs, followed by Voix une Crise and Lettre, Morte, the two that I'll be looking at a bit later. And Leigh, she describes the writing of Trois Parcs, the first book in this series, as an evacuation of the psychological pain and grief, with writing becoming a salutary gesture. She says, I lived 2 years pregnant, full of a great pain that only kind of saw the day with when I finished or when I completed Trois Parcs. Writing is thus presented or seen here as a therapeutic exercise for Leigh, and these 3 works can be considered autopathographies given the clear autofictional nature of them and the clear kind of like dominance and exploration of psychological suffering. For the sake of kind of, like I said, time and thinking space during this paper, I'll focus more on Voix une Crise, as we see in this text, Leigh's attempt to communicate the brief but significant interaction between a young woman experiencing psychological distress with a psychiatric hospital. The hospital serves as an unhelpful, aggravating starting point for the autofictional narrator as she eventually leaves, going into an unnamed city, evoking her fears and distinctly bodily pain linked to her psychological suffering. The following and final text of the triptych, which I'll touch on at the end, Lettre Morte, sees Leigh aim to evoke the intense pain and suffering of the autofictional narrator, but in an enclosed, even claustrophobic space of an apartment, while she dialogues with a largely benevolent figure called Sirius and experiences visions of Morgue, an ex-lover, having some nice deathly connotations there with that name, as well as visions of her dead father. Both texts, despite being written retrospectively by Leigh after her period of psychological suffering, aim to evoke the visceral immediacy of this suffering rather than writing them from the perspective of an illness survivor, which is how many illness narratives are framed. I argue that the 2 texts can be mapped onto 2 different types of illness narrative, as elaborated by Arthur W. Frank in his seminal text, The Wounded Storyteller, Body, Illness and Ethics. Voix une Crise can be seen as a chaos narrative, a type of illness narrative in opposition to the more hopeful, chronological, and retrospectively ordered illness narrative of restitution. In contrast, the chaos narrative is one in which the plot imagines life never getting any better, an absence of narrative order and revelations of vulnerability, futility, impotence, and fear. This can clearly be seen in Voix une Crise with the loose narrative arc as the autofictional narrator moves from the psychiatric hospital to outside her apartment, a church, outside again. There is an aspect of a journey, but this is divided into short, interrupted vignettes interspersed with evocative snapshots of pain and an ambiguous ending alluding to suicide. There's no kind of curative or hopeful gesture at the end, rather than a resigned sense of peace after a breathless narrative of physical pain, fear, and mistrust. So in this quotation, I'll touch on a few bits of it in English. We can see here one of the more, it's a visceral description. It's distinctly violent bodily description. She describes plunging her fingers into her, I should have done a trigger warning at the beginning. So she plunges her fingers into her eye sockets to try to stop her nerves, because she believes that there is she believes that there's a kind of a nefarious power called the organization, capitalized with the O, who is kind of invaded or infected her body and is kind of controlling her in a way. According to the narrator, these voices from the organization tell her to harm herself, follow her through the city, stalking her. As we can see in the quotation, it's the narrator's body, flesh and matter that has been invaded rather than her mind. The mind in this kind of elusive, kind of unpin-downable definition. Further, the body becomes the locus of the battle between the narrator and the organization. The narrator self-mutilates at different points in the text to stop the spread of these voices, to quieten the voices, and potentially also to follow the voices' orders. So it becomes a kind of this sort of vicious circle or Ouroboros of the body kind of being the battlefield in a way between her and this mysterious organization. So in these two quotations, in the first one is when she alludes to kind of hurting herself to try to stop the voices, and then in the and also potentially to follow the voices' orders. And in the second one, she talks about taking sleeping pills to try and quieten the voices. Like I said, this seems to be a hopeless battle with the narrator's body becoming more and more weakened by the troubling voices, their orders, and her own physical attempts to shut them out. There is a chaos in the form of uncontrollability in the narrative. Frank describes a chaos narrative in a similarly bodily way. He says, I quote, "The story traces the edges of a wound that can only be told around. Words suggest its rawness, but that wound is so much of the body, its insults, agonies, and losses that words necessarily fail," end quote. He also adds that there is no distance or reflection possible with a chaos narrative. It is pure immediacy. We see this clearly in Voix and Crise as we follow the narrator in this seemingly unplanned, uncontrolled trajectory, as well as through the sort of chopped vignette structure. We live through every moment, every vignette of pain. Further, this consistent viscerality in descriptions of automutilation, as well as imagined, hallucinated, and nightmarish bodily violence of the narrator herself and also of her abandoned father for whom she's grieving, all of these vignettes combine to give the overall sense that this text is an open wound. There are inevitable comparisons to be made to literary trauma and testimony theory, particularly Kathy Carruth's fruitful use of the wound. What is significant in Leigh's text, however, is that we do not know, excluding for the moment the kind of authorial biographical information I gave you at the beginning and kind of giving you throughout. When you read it, you're unaware of kind of what triggered the narrator's hospitalization. There's no moment of diagnosis in this illness narrative. There's no explanation of trauma to claim to understand the narrator. There are allusions to mental illness, however, there's no naming. There's the death of the father and grief, but again, we're unaware of the circumstances. The origins, causes, parameters of the wound are unknown. The lack of knowing and ambiguity complicate the event-based model of Carruth's trauma theorizations, as well as illness narrative models, which often start at a point of infection or diagnosis. So a significant part of the troubling and visceral nature of Leigh's text is the representation of the psychiatric hospital at the beginning and the mistrust of psychiatric doctors communicated in one of the vignettes. The absence of therapeutic encounter or doctor-patient interaction make the narrative even more chaotic, despairing, and resigned, as there seems to be no hope for the narrator. Here we see the first line. I'm giving loads of spoilers to this text. Sorry. The first line places the narrator in an archetypal hospital space. She says, "I'm sat on a bench in a long corridor lit up by neon lights. I don't know where I am. I'm in a crisis center, like they told me, or in a theater with actors who play their part and who have enlisted me, leaving me the choice of lines." So the archetypal plainness of the space is offset by the narrator not knowing where she is and having to be told where she is. The reference to theatre and playing a role suggests that there is a greater power controlling the space, defining the narrative, and that despite her choice of lines, as she says at the end, she still has to be enlisted in this troupe of psychiatric patients and players or actors, and now has become one of them. Sociologist Irving Goffman's work on asylums is useful at this point. He writes of the, quote, deviant community that forms in an asylum as well as other internment institutions. Individuals enter and slowly become members of this community, stigmatizing them further as they become members and making them become even more alienated than the communities they were in outside of these institutions. In this initial hospital vignette, the long sentences, overlapping speech, uncertain or unknown speakers, and consistent emphasis on noise makes the hospital space one of intoxicating influence. This can be seen through the narrator's apparent lack of speech as the others approach her to talk or shout in the corridors. She becomes swallowed up by their speech as they evoke the punitive aspects of the space. So here I've listed a few of the quotations from this initial longer vignette set in the hospital. So a person says, aren't there cameras here? They're watching us or surveilling us, but they won't let us leave. I don't know where I am. The philosopher, who's one of the kind of actors, character / psychiatric patients, here says, the philosopher murmurs phrases without end, like waving his arms about, saying, suicide is allowed, everything. If suicide is allowed, everything is allowed. The next quotation says, we're in prison here, there's only madmen. And then finally, they take me for Camille Claudel here. Sorry, there's a little typo there. We're in prison. There are too many bad influence. You lose your head. These fears of being trapped and watched, sort of, as we can see here, accumulating and being spoken, often repeated by these characters, keep on increasing during this hospital scene, with the Camille Claudel intertext here raising fears of a gendered experience of hospitalization, one based on misogynistic control rather than understanding and cure. The cacophony of voices, questions to the narrators continue until this vignette ends with the narrator apparently alone and seemingly exhausted by the sensory bombardment of the hospital space. I'm just going to double check. Oh no, sorry, I don't have this quote, but she says, Je reste seule, assise dans le long corridor, plongée dans la pénombre. So she says, I'm alone, sat in the long corridor, plunged in kind of like darkness or shadow. So there are no clear narrative clues in terms of chronology, but the fact that the beginning of the text has the corridor lit up with the neon lights and then it's finally dark suggests that the narrator has been surrounded by these questions, shouts, despairing and fatalistic thoughts for a whole day. After this initial longer vignette, the text jumps from the psychiatric hospital to the narrator's apartment and then later to other places in the city. These subsequent vignettes do not show the narrator in any way cured, quote unquote, or changed. In fact, we learn more about her suffering and her thoughts when she is outside of the hospital space. The latter is not distinctly negative or pejorative in a nightmarish sense, as we often see in popular culture, from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest to American Horror Story, but there is a definitive sense that the mere corridor of the hospital space that the narrator was sat in led to further alienation and certainly no rehabilitation. There is one nurse mentioned, but she does not speak. She holds back one of the patients from escaping and then is described sitting at a table with two other people, and it is unclear whether they are patients themselves or members of staff. The lack of activity on the part of the space and its staff to engage with the patients and how they speak to each other suggests a fatalism in understandings of mental illness, the function and role of the space, as well as their ability to help the patients. The space and its one nurse just contain and control. The question of control, as evoked by the patients in the earlier negative statements, becomes increasingly sinister throughout the text, with the narrator detailing her fear of the supposed organization, hunting her down and controlling her thoughts. Psychiatrists become part of this controlling, menacing organization when she says, oh yeah, here we have this quotation. She says, I'll just jump to a little bit of it in English, where she talks about the great inquisitors, the psychiatrists. They do it with their honeyed words, trying to make me believe that the organization is just my delirium. So there's a double menace of the psychiatrists in this quotation. They ask, number one, too many invasive questions, like the capitalized reference to the Inquisition, while they also ignore and refuse to believe what the narrator has to say. We also have an additional reference to the body double bind in this quotation, as the doctors tell her that the organization is born of her own delirium or ravings, thus it is rooted in her own body, and she is the cause of her own suffering and fear. This, we can only imagine, exacerbates the hopelessness and emphasizes the fatalism inadvertently confirmed to the narrator by those supposed to help her. The representation of these doctors in the psychiatric hospital in the beginning are clearly presented as aggravating the narrator's suffering, with the only option for her being the ambiguous ending, when it seems that she lies down, she's finally escaped, and she lies down in a snowy place, looks up at the sky and says that she finally feels peace. This could be a salutary moment, but I feel like it can also be a representation of suicide or resigning to her suffering. It is significant to note that Lay has written and referenced suicide extensively in her works, while she has also written about her own suicidal ideation at points in her life, making the suicidal reading of this ending more plausible. In contrast to Voix in Crise, and this is kind of my guise of conclusion, the conclusion of Lettre Morte is more hopeful and gestures towards a form of survival. Further, there is a more positive therapeutic encounter that occurs throughout the narrative, as the autofictional narrator is speaking to a friend called Sirius about her, among other topics, her dead father, a former lover, and her psychological suffering. The move to a more dialogic text in the triptych suggests that Lay is presenting a more hopeful vision of therapeutic encounters, albeit not in a traditional doctor-patient or analyst-analysand dynamic and space. Further, the talking through that occurs throughout the text and the openness to working through suggest a shift in type of narrative. Voix in Crise, as I said, is an example of a type of chaos narrative, which contrasts to the more hopeful interactive aspect of Lettre Morte, which, despite its references to visions, hallucinations, and suffering, like in Trois Parcs and in Voix in Crise, seems to still keep the chaos at bay by the end of the narrative. The narrator states to Sirius at the end, again, I'm giving all the, giving the entire story and spoilers and the ending away. She says, day is breaking, Sirius, thus, or go open the window, let the freshness or coldness of dawn come in. So the poignancy of a new dawn, as well as freshness and this coolness, the fraîcheur, suggests a restorative conclusion to the text and to the triptych itself. Frank calls this kind of narrative what he would call a quest narrative, one that acknowledges chaos but keeps it at bay, foregrounds the voice of the patient as in control of the narrative, and is also, I quote, defined by the ill person's belief that something is to be gained through the experience. For the autofictional narrator, in Lettre Morte, she alludes to clarity and an expelling of past pain at the end of Lettre Morte. For Lay, she gains, for Lay, the writer, she gains her writing and her two texts, this triptych that she's written after the 2-year period of extreme kind of psychological suffering. Further, it's significant that these two texts and Trois Parcs, the triptych itself, are merely examples among Lay's wide range of texts, from fiction to autofiction to literary criticism addressing the topic of psychological suffering. The personal and political objectives of such an authorial dedication to these themes, or perhaps an obsession with the topic, are what I plan to explore next in my thesis. Thank you for listening.
That was absolutely brilliant, Rebecca. Thank you. Really fascinating. Without further ado, I'll introduce our second speaker, and then we'll get cracking with the Q&A, because I'm sure everyone's already got lots of interesting comments and thoughts about your paper. So thank you for that. Our second speaker today is Benjamin Dalton, who is a researcher in contemporary French thought and culture. He recently received his PhD in French from King's College London, with his thesis entitled Plasticity in Contemporary French Thought, Literature and Film, Witnessing Transformations with Catherine Malabou. His recent publications include an article on plasticity in the writing of Marie Darrieussecq, entitled Forms of Freedoms, Marie Darrieussecq, Catherine Malabou, and the Plasticity of Science, and that's in Dalhousie French Studies. He's also published a book chapter on queerness and plasticity entitled Cruising the Queer Forest with Alain Guiraudy, Woods, Plastics, Plasticities, and an interview with Catherine Malabou in Paragraph. He also led the collaborative project Narrating Plasticity, Stories of Transformations Between the Plastic Arts and the Neurosciences, which was funded by the Culture team at King's and brought together researchers in clinical neuroscience with the ceramicist Amanda Deutsch. He currently teaches English language, literature and theory at Paris-Nanterre University and the New Sorbonne University in Paris. And today, Benjamin will be presenting his paper, Catherine Malabou's Clinic. Thanks very much, Benjamin.
Thank you very much. You can all hear me now? Great. Okay, so what I'm going to present today is kind of very preliminary ideas and research that will kind of hopefully become my postdoctoral project or my postdoctoral research. So I'm just going to try them out, and then we'll be very happy to hear anyone's comments at the end of that. So today I want to explore the philosophy of Catherine Malabou, asking how her philosophy challenges current understandings of medicine and clinical care. In particular, I want to argue that Malabou's philosophy rewrites the clinic, and that close attention to her work can lead us to imagine new models of the hospital and new kinds of therapeutic spaces and architectures. To do this, I will focus on Malabou's work on brain injury and neuropathology, in which people's identities transform in such radical ways that they no longer recognize their surroundings or loved ones, or whose past selves and memories appear completely destroyed. In my reading of Malabou, I ask, how can hospitals be best redesigned to care for people whose prior identities have been completely transformed or lost entirely? I argue that Malabou's philosophy provides creative answers to this question. I suggest that an attention to the question of space in Malabou's thought provides ideas as to how the physical space, architecture, and environment of hospitals can transform to respond to patients who have undergone dramatic neurological transformation. In this talk, then, I'll focus on three main areas. Firstly, I'll outline Malabou's philosophy of plasticity and what it means for medicine and hospital care. Secondly, I'll suggest how Malabou's philosophy challenges other French thought and philosophy surrounding the hospital and clinical architecture, particularly Michel Foucault's critique of the clinic. And finally, I'll put Malabou in dialogue with the experimental architectures and architectural philosophy of Shusaku Arikara and Madeleine Jins. So I ask, what kinds of new hospitals and clinical structures does Malabou's philosophy envisage? And could these actually be brought into existence? Oh. There we go. So first, a whistle-stop tour of Malabou's philosophy and its relation to medicine and pathology. So Malabou is a contemporary philosopher whose interdisciplinary work explores dialogues between continental philosophy, biology, in particular neurobiology, and the medical sciences, among other disciplines. Malabou's central concept is that of plasticity, or la plasticité, which he elaborates at the intersections of these disciplines. So plasticity for Malabou describes an innate transformability at the heart of all life forms and structures of life. The word plasticity comes from the Greek plas sign, which means to shape or to mold. Throughout her work, for example, Malabou returns to the example of the plastic arts. Sculpture, in particular, entails the sculpting or manipulation of form. She evokes plastic surgery, the nipping and tucking through which the body becomes molded like a sculpture. She evokes plastics, those synthetic materials that can be anything from our bank cards to Barbie to 3D printed medical implants. However, plasticity does not just mean change or mutability. Malabou specifies, plastic describes something that can both take form and give form. Plasticity is the power to transform, but also to resist endless manipulation and hold a form in place, no matter how fleetingly. So I quote, I'll put the French on the screen and I'll read the English. So the adjective plastic, while certainly not in opposition to rigid, fixed and ossified, is not to be confused with polymorphous. Things that are plastic preserve their shape, as does the marble in a statue. Once given a configuration, it is unable to recover its initial form. However, Malabou shows how there is also an explosive, dynamitic side to plasticity. Here she is talking about plastic explosives and the threat of plasticage. And so the word plasticage means bombing in French, and le plastique can refer to an explosive. So plasticity is then two opposites. On the one side, I quote, those concrete shapes in which form is crystallized, sculpture, and then on the other side, I quote, the annihilation of all form, such as the bomb. Both mutant and explosive, plasticity describes an unruly mode of transformation, creative and unpredictable. Following her initial works on plasticity in philosophical contexts, Malabou goes on to focus on the sciences, and in particular contemporary biology and epigenetics. The innate transformability that plasticity describes is to be found most radically, perhaps, Malabou shows, in the biological mutability of all organic life. This mutability is increasingly emerging in scientific research into biological and neurological plasticity. So the human brain, for example, is neuroplastic in that it changes and manipulates its own neural form throughout a lifetime. Neural identity shapes itself, self-sculpts, develops and becomes through changing its own plastic form. Malabou is, however, not primarily interested in the plasticity of the healthy brain. Again, Malabou insists upon the explosive element of plasticity. At the heart of Malabou's philosophy is in fact a consideration of what happens when plasticity goes wrong. Plasticity, Malabou tells us, describes not just malleability, but also an intrinsic fragility and explosivity. Plasticity can only too easily become plasticage. So this is shown in Malabou's work most radically in the case of neuropathology and brain trauma. Following a neural event or trauma, the brain can become irrevocably damaged and a person's former identity lost forever. Malabou's threefold definition of plasticity, then, the giving, receiving, and exploding of form, finds its neurological correlate in the brain's teetering on the line between malleability and vulnerability, resilience and total destruction. Further, then Malabou demonstrates how pathological forms of plasticity refuse to comply with traditional forms of medical knowledge or conventional forms of treatment. Certain types of brain trauma are unable to be reversed or healed. In her 2007 book, The New Wounded, Les Nouveaux Blessés, for example, Malabou shows how the injured brain resists all types of psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic intervention. For this reason, Malabou's philosophy necessarily engages with medical discourses, the limits of medical discourses, and the types of medical care and therapies that emerge or fail to emerge in relation to plastic bodies and brains. So, the main books that deal with neuropathology and brain injury in Malabou's oeuvre are The New Wounded, Les Nouveaux Blessés, that I've already talked about, Ontology of the Accident, Ontologie de l'Accident, and Self and Emotional Life, which was co-written with Adrian Johnston. In The New Wounded, Malabou gives examples of famous cases of brain injury in which a person has transformed to the extent at which they are no longer themselves, their personalities changing in a split second as described by the people around them. A well-known case which Malabou explores, for example, is that of Phineas P. Gage. So Gage was a railroad construction worker who was one day involved in an accident in which an iron rod passed through his skull, severely damaging the left frontal lobe of his brain. Gage's personality transformed in a split second. Malabou quotes the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who says, "Gage was no longer Gage." In Malabou's reading, Gage's traumatic brain injury catalyzes a complete metamorphosis in which he is no longer recognizable by friends and family. Malabou's philosophy also touches upon more personal ground, however, recalling her own grandmother's transformation through Alzheimer's and detailing the sudden indifférence or indifference and emotional detachment of her grandmother while she was suffering from Alzheimer's. So here we find a direct engagement with the space of the hospital and a bold but fleeting suggestion of how the hospital could be different. So Malabou evokes in particular how going to the hospital was a violent experience for her grandmother. In doing so, she proposes another way of imagining therapy for people with Alzheimer's relating to questions of space and belonging. I quote, "I would have understood, despite the incoherent behaviour and visible indifference of my grandmother, the degree to which hospitalisation was violent for her. I would have tried to take her back home for a few hours. I would have given her the chance to regain her familial surroundings, her things. I would not have tried to get her to regain her memory at any cost, but rather I would have left her, as Proust says, to be present at or to witness her own absence." So the problem with current therapies and with hospital spaces, Malabou suggests, is that they try to force people with brain injuries or neurodegenerative diseases to remember their past selves in ways which do not help them and which in fact lead to further distress. Indeed, initiatives such as memory rooms have been used to treat people with Alzheimer's. So this is an example of a memory room. These rooms aim to recreate spaces from a person's youth, for example, the 1940s or the 1950s, filled with furniture, textures, wallpaper, products, smells, etc., that might allow a person to recover parts of their memory. Malabou, however, goes totally in the opposite direction. Malabou wants to take her grandmother home and put her in her familiar surroundings, not to try and restore or recover her grandmother's memory, but to allow her grandmother to experience her own absence and to explore her own self-strangeness as prompted by these surroundings. So I read this as Malabou's attempt to transform and even reverse the relationship between space and therapy in clinical care. Out of Malabou's philosophy emerges a proposition whereby the hospital attempts not to reverse, resist, or restore loss of memory or loss of self, but rather to let be, accept, and even lean into this loss, self-strangeness, and self-absence. Malabou's therapies involve embracing the radicality of the transformations seen in brain injury and disease, no matter how terrifying or disorientating these transformations may be. Malabou's philosophy might help us to think about how hospital and clinical space might be reconfigured around embracing, sorry, just checking the time. How long have I got? Okay. Embracing unfamiliarity, self-strangeness, and neurocorporal transformation as an emancipatory therapeutics. So I conducted an interview with Malabou in 2019 and asked her about the relation between space plasticity and transformation. I wanted to know how plasticity is experienced within space or how people transform in relation to space. So Malabou replied, "That is a very complicated question, because first, what is space? I think for a long time we've conceptualized space as a simple projection of our internal space. This has to be totally stopped. Space has nothing to do with our personal projections. With people like Alzheimer's patients, there is no internal space anymore. So plasticity has to be created out of nothing, and space appears as an unexpected, unpredictable experience. Here they discover space out of space, rather than projecting their own space, and this is why they are disoriented. This is the old notion of orientation, which Kant talked about. If I am in the dark, I can always distinguish my right hand from my left hand because I have this feeling of internal difference. But then for Alzheimer's patients, the distinction between left and right doesn't mean anything. So space is really the encounter with externality per se, the great outdoors." So Malabou's evocation of space as the great outdoors insists upon space as a site of radical encounter. Again, Malabou's interest is not in how space becomes familiar, comfortable, or belongs to us, but rather how space might reveal itself to be radically other. Space is rendered raw here. It is no longer the familiarly mapped projection of a psyche that has learned to make cartographic sense of it, but now precisely the materiality of a new, undiscovered, and disorientating world. What if clinical spaces were able to embrace this disorientating, transformative quality of space, rather than trying to use space to cancel out disorientation or pause transformation? All right, so I want now to briefly consider how Malabou's philosophy of explosive plastic bodies and brains and the kinds of clinical spaces that these bodies and brains require challenges existing French philosophies of the hospital and of medical care. So in particular, I argue, Malabou's philosophy challenges the critique of the clinic in Michel Foucault's The Birth of the Clinic, Naissance de la Clinique, written in 1963, which is undoubtedly one of the most influential philosophical engagements with hospital medicine and the clinic of the 20th century. So Foucault's text figures a historical critique of the clinic. Here, Foucault characterizes the clinic as a space systematically designed around the surveillance, control, and the reproduction of normative bodies. Like Malabou, Foucault also engages with the clinic through the lens of space, although in a completely different way. Foucault famously begins, "This book is about space, about language, and about death. It is about the act of seeing, the gaze." Chronologically then, Foucault's primary concern is that of space, and space's relation to the medical gaze, or le regard, as he calls it in French. What Foucault names the birth, or the naissance, of the modern clinic comes about precisely through a shift in the spatialization of illness. In the first chapter, Foucault identifies the three main shifts in the spatialization of disease. So first, primary spatialization. A disease is conceptualized completely independently of the human body and ordered via a disconnected table of characteristics and pathological genealogies. Secondly, following this, secondary spatialization enters the realm of, the reality of the patient's body back into the study of pathology, mapping instead the specific intersection between body and disease. Finally, tertiary spatialization names the institutionalization of illness into physical social architectures, such as the clinic or the hospital. All the while, Foucault is interested in how these developments in the spatial apprehension and construction of disease relate to the gaze, or le regard. The shift from primary to tertiary spatialization enables a heightened visibility of the ill body. So here, the once static classificatory gaze by which diseases were mapped and labeled independently of the suffering body in primary spatialization becomes a much more dynamic and mobile gaze, capable of tracking, mapping, and controlling the fluctuations of disease in the organic body. The shifting spatialization of illness and healthcare for Foucault, then, is necessarily an ideological movement whereby humans and their diseases become increasingly institutionalized. The ill body, in the dynamic tertiary spatialization of the institutionalized clinic, is subject to an intense surveillance. Space becomes a punitive and generative structure through which the individual body and subject are constructed. So Cindy Patton, for example, in the introduction to her edited volume, Rebirth of the Clinic, suggests a link between Foucault's spatial exploration of the clinic and his work on the prison and the panopticon in Discipline and Punish, Surveiller et Punir, in 1975. In the panopticon, architecture is instrumental in enabling the complete surveillance and biopolitical capture of the imprisoned body. For Foucault, then, the spatialization of disease and the physical institutional architectures through which the spatialization is enabled constitute increasing insertion of the body into the realm of biopolitics. There is no escape from the biopolitical capture of the body within this spatialization. In contrast to Foucault, Malabou's determination to clear a space, as she says, for neurological patients, seeks to take seriously everything about the body that cannot be healed or recuperated and what resists ideological manipulation and the biopolitical. She is interested in precisely what kind of clinical structure would accept and let be the post-traumatic plastic body's radical refusal to be recuperated or healed. What kind of clinical structure would allow the body to escape ideological care and escape any biopolitical injunction to maintain normative functionality. So in this final section now, I want to bring Malabou into dialogue with the architects Arikara and Gins in order to try and imagine in more concrete architectural terms what kind of clinical architecture could support and encourage Malabou's more emancipatory philosophy of healthcare. So while she does not explicitly refer to experimental architectural design in her work on neuropathology, Malabou speaks elsewhere about the necessity to bring art into hospital design. So in my interview, Malabou underscores the importance of the encounter with aesthetic forms in the hospital. She says, "We should imagine hospitals and other clinical institutions like real spaces of living. Artists should design these spaces. Alzheimer's patients, for example, lose their capacities for orientation. So let's build them gardens with sculptures through which they can walk like labyrinths. The only way, I believe, would be to introduce art into this space, because the experience of form and the reintroduction of the relationship with forms would be extremely beneficial." Further, Malabou suggests an architectural design by artists and architects Shusaku Arikara and Madeline Gins, as an example. So she says, even when plasticity is destroyed, it still holds onto a relationship with form. We would still have to recreate a relationship with forms for these patients. This could be to make them listen to music, to make them play with Play-Doh, make them go in these gardens I was talking about, instead of forcing them to answer the question, who are you? There is a project for Alzheimer's gardens by Arikara and Gins called Healing Funhouse. Arikara and Gins designed a kind of labyrinth in which you cannot get lost because there's a sort of thread, something that guides you, even for very disorientated people. And at the same time, you experience these colors and shapes. Malabou's conception of the clinic, then, privileges a quote-unquote relationship with forms that is the opposite to the question, who are you? New forms are allowed to arise rather than old forms and attachments being forced. Malabou's brief mention of Arikara and Gins, I argue, demands more attention. These architects, I want to suggest, could hold the key to deploying Malabou's philosophy within actual clinical arenas. So let me just check the time. Okay, I'll try and draw this to a close. Shusaku Arikara, a Japanese artist and architect, and Madeline Gins, an American writer and artist, are well known for their collaborations, which spanned architecture and philosophical writing, amongst other areas. One of their most notable ideas is that of reversible destiny, the notion that through a particular type of interaction with architecture, human bodies can live longer, even forever. One of Arikara and Gins' most well-known architectures related to this project is the site of Reversible Destiny in Yoro, Japan. This entails several discrete architectural structures situated in the Yoro Park. The site of Reversible Destiny is a constructed landscape of many different types of terrains, structures, enclosures, and slopes. Arikara and Gins speak about the philosophy behind their architectures in their manifestos and works of architectural theory, such as Architectural Body, which they published in 2002. Arikara and Gins seek to use architecture to challenge bodies to cultivate modes of bodily awareness that might in turn lead to transformations in consciousness. Arikara and Gins therefore pursue architectures that are in many ways disorientating and disturbing, forcing the body to re-question its habitual movements and enter into a forever renewed, attentive relationship with surroundings. So the complete opposite to the memory rooms that we saw earlier. The body is forced to reinterrogate its usual sense of belonging within these spaces, in terms of knowing how to move around a space, or knowing what a space is for or what it represents. Another example of this are the Reversible Destiny Lofts in Tokyo. These apartments feature undulating floors with uneven surfaces, spaces that are purposefully cramped to encourage bodies to press themselves up against them, figure out how to move and pass through them. Russ Hughes argues that Arakawa and Jin's architectures attempt to catalyze within the body a destruction of the ego and a deconstruction of the sovereignty of the self. I quote, Jins and Arakawa argue that the historical construction of the subject as singular subjective sovereign I inhibits the body's ability to explore and know itself. Arakawa and Jin's architectures then work in the opposite manner to Foucault's disciplinary architectures. Rather than being Foucault's productive architectures, which construct and reproduce docile policed subjects, Arakawa and Jin's architectures seem to work backwards. They take a constructed subject and invite this subject to deconstruct itself, let go of its supposed identity and associated environment, relax and become undone. Indeed, Malabou herself turns to Arakawa and Jin's architectures in a short article entitled The Living Room, Plasticity and Hospitality, published in 2013. Here, Malabou appears to be searching for physical spaces which are hospitable to the mutability of plastic bodies, and in which the regenerative and destructive plasticities of biological organisms can embrace their radical transformability. Malabou's clinic then, imagined through these transformative architectures, promises the reversal of Foucault's constructivist clinic. Malabou's clinic does not just resist the subject's construction under surveillance, it actively reverses this construction. Or rather, the subject is allowed to relax in this construction and embrace modes of coming undone and self-transformation. So I'll draw to a close here on this quite open-ended challenge of how to invent and design hospital structures that allow for an atmosphere in which patients can embrace their own deconstruction, self-alterity, and radical transformation. So, oh, sorry, I forgot to show you a few of the other photos there. So there is much exciting work currently happening on hospital architecture. The recent Wellcome Trust exhibition, Living with Buildings, for example, looks at intersections between mental well-being and built environment, and Stephen Federber's extensive work on the historical transformations in hospital design and clinical architecture also underlines the intrinsic relationship that architecture and space have to well-being, treatment, and healing. So I think that an analysis of Malabou's destructive plasticity has a lot to add to this work, and that these practical engagements with architecture across architectural theory and history could in turn propose ways for Malabou's philosophy of medicine to be built into the concrete reality of everyday hospital healthcare. Thank you very much.
I always feel like I have to do a little clap in these things. It always feels so silent afterwards. That was absolutely fascinating, Ben. Thank you so much for that. Absolutely brilliant. It's already got people asking questions in the chat, so I think I'll just dive in because these questions are both sort of directed towards your paper and they're both related. So I'm going to kick off if that's okay. So first question, what do specialist medics who work with Alzheimer's patients make of Malabou's suggestions about the patient exploring their own self-strangeness? And then the second question is, in the case of Alzheimer's patients, patient-doctor relationship is mostly the doctor's relation to the patient's family, who often want their beloved person back. So how could the doctor mediate perhaps this self-strangeness and make it acceptable to the family? So two sort of related questions there for you, Ben.
Sorry, I muted the mic. Those are really, really difficult questions. I will have to, for the first one, what do specialist medics who work with Alzheimer's patients make of Malabou's suggestions? I think, yeah, in terms of Alzheimer's specialists specifically, I would need to look into that more. That's a really good question that I will look into more. I know that her work on neuroscience has been kind of quite well received with a few leading neuroscientists. For example, her first work, What Should We Do With Our Brain? Que faire de notre cerveau, which was in 2005, I think. She kind of argued that the popular discourses of neuroplasticity following from scientific elaborations of neuroplasticity had kind of become a little bit ideologically inflected, and that when a lot of people talk about neuroplasticity, for example, I don't know, when you go on the internet and you look at books on neuroplasticity, and there's a lot of books, kind of self-help books, being like 10 ways to improve your neuroplasticity, and 10 ways to become a better worker, and 10 ways to improve your memory, etc. That neuroplasticity had kind of been ideologically co-opted and become what she calls a kind of flexibility rather than plasticity. So she kind of argued that whilst what she sees as plasticity is this kind of creative, explosive, unruly, resistant kind of materiality, this plasticity kind of being co-opted in kind of popular discourses was more of a flexibility, which kind of didn't explode or create, but just kind of bent and flexed to whatever was kind of asked of it. And there is an introduction to this book by Mark Janarada, I think, that is kind of very supportive of these conclusions about the need to realize the kind of true creative potentiality of plasticity. So in terms of doctors working with actual Alzheimer's patients, I'll need to, nothing's coming to me instantly, but I'll need to look into that a bit more. The second question, in the case of Alzheimer's patient doctor relationship, is mostly the doctor's relation to the patient's family, who often want their beloved person back. How could the doctor mediate this self-strangeness? Yeah, that's a very, very difficult question as well. So Malabou talks a lot about, and I think this is where it also kind of has resonances with Becky's paper as well. So, and this is one of the things that I talked about a lot in my thesis, is that Malabou's philosophy has a lot of resonances with narrative as well, and the question of narrative, and how people that have kind of undergone these radical transformations can self-narrate and talk about themselves in the I. Like if you've gone through a transformation in which you currently no longer recognize yourself or know your past, how do you tell your life story? How do you introduce yourself? Whatever. But there have been certain responses to Malabou's work on this, and one is by Christopher Watkin, that says, although Malabou says that that there's a complete and utter gap in the narrative of a singular person's lifetime, the narrative leading up to the trauma, and then a completely different narrative afterwards, and they have, these two narratives have nothing to do with it. Christopher Watkin says we need to kind of explore the third person narrative of this person that is told obviously by the friends and family, which are central to Shirley's question here. And yeah, that's definitely something that I would have to think about. I think that's partly a reason why I'm really interested in architecture and space, precisely because the hospital holds all of these relations within it. The hospital isn't just the space for the ill person. The hospital necessarily has to show hospitality to the family and friends that are also coming, and necessarily also provide spaces for those people to be in, and spaces for those people to meet their loved ones that are in the hospital in. And yeah, I guess that would be one of the questions that I'd want to explore through architecture and space, this question of the doctor-patient relationship and with the patient's family, and yeah, and how it would be possible to encourage family to accept and even let be this new self-strangeness. It's a really difficult question. I think Malabou's philosophy makes no lie of the fact that this is always kind of a painful transformation. She kind of, I don't think she's ever saying, oh, these transformations are only to be celebrated and exultant, and they are very creative, but they are necessarily also violent and painful and dark transformations. So yeah, that I definitely want to think more about that. Yeah, thanks for those questions.
Just before we dive into more questions, Hannah has recommended a film tip, The Man Whose Mind Exploded, so you might want to note that down. While we wait for more questions, feel free to put them into the chat. I've got a question for Becky. I found it really interesting how the hospital. And to be honest, this goes across both papers, the space of the hospital and identity and how they're connected. But particularly, Becky, how you talk about theatricality, and I thought it was really interesting how it's described as a theatre. And whether you could speak on, I'm just going to throw some thoughts at you. So it made me think of when you said she like plunges into darkness. I thought, well, this kind of represents, potentially, I've never read the text, but in the sense of sort of the theatre sort of curtain closing, and whether you've thought about, so it's about voices. It just triggers that Stendhal says a lot about masks and about wearing different masks in society, and whether that in the hospital space, identity and masks sort of unravel, whether there's new masks that are put on. Especially, I understand that in this terms of, it reminds me of Shutter Island, as in the sense of he thinks that he's part of this play and that everybody's an actor. But I did think, well, in Stendhal's text, he does talk about how we're all acting in society anyway, and I just wondered if you could speak a bit more on voices, theatricality. I'm just throwing thoughts.
It's really useful, and it's I was it was mainly on rereading the text to kind of have a go at writing this paper that I picked up more on the theatrical aspects. And yeah, you're absolutely right with the darkness at the end there. That could be an added point. It's so the kind of the acting in society and wearing masks, definitely, and it seems here in this particular space that it becomes more more controlled or more enforced potentially, or more potentially more pernicious in a way. You go in, and the kind of the atmospherics of the place, the kind of the miasma in a way is very makes the patients or the people there very susceptible to certain identities, and that kind of goes back to Goffman, the theorist sociologist I mentioned, who kind of talks a lot about the sociological and identity kind of influence of the space on people there, as well as the people who act as staff and orderlies as well. And I mean, there's tons and tons of psychological psychiatric research on kind of like the role playing and how that can impact how you treat how you interact with the other people there based on the power dynamic. But to turn to the idea of theatricality, something I didn't mention was the names of the people there. So they all have, at first I read it as kind of almost like a fairy tale parable, because Leigh uses a lot of fairy tale motifs throughout all of her works, and obviously like having like a nominal character or an unnamed nominal character is quite a common motif in fairy tales. But I think it could also works really well in like the kind of theatre aspect. They kind of take it like they've just been named, they've been given they're named. For example, there's the woman in the hat, and then there's the philosopher. So they all have these kind of sort of status and appearance names, which lends itself to kind of like a dramatic reading, as if this is some sort of, it's almost like a very Beckettian kind of distressing play. So it's definitely that theatrical aspect, and I think also having it almost as viewing it as like a theatrical preface, it kind of sets up the text kind of quite not nicely, but kind of in a this sets up the kind of what happens afterwards to this woman moving around all these different spaces, like I said. The fact that the drama almost, or like the kind of like the theatrical kind of unity and conclusion of the hospital space has ended, and now we're kind of free roaming open space. And there's the kind of a paradox there that I kind of slightly alluded to, the fact that the hospital spaces where she's supposed to have the therapeutic encounters, the challenges, the talking therapies, and it's almost outside when she's in this open space that she has, bearing in mind they're not in like a traditional therapeutic encounter, but there seems to be some sort of encounter with the page and with narrative, and she's able to do that outside of the hospital. So I feel like there's a kind of an outside of the drama, so to speak, of the hospital space. And that's also leads me on to another little topic like this. Something I'm kind of entangled with, or getting tangled up with these texts, is the resistance to completely criticizing medical and psychiatric institutions, because I think there's also a tendency to do that. I don't think with this work Lay is necessarily presenting like a pejorative medical institution, or like deriding or criticizing kind of traditional treatments and traditional kind of therapies, but there are certainly like questions that like overlap now that I think about it more with after hearing Ben's paper, this idea of space and where these encounters can take place and with whom, and what's the kind of power dynamic of the encounter. I think those are kind of big questions, but it's not like anti-psychiatry, let's say, and it's not kind of criticizing medicine like completely, absolutely. There's more nuance there, I think, with the criticism. Anyway, yeah.
Thank you so much. We've now got a question for Ben in regard to Alzheimer's patients. Does Malabou address how older patients in the advanced stages of the disease engage with external spaces as their bodies change?
So that's a really good question. The two main examples that I can think of about this is what she said in the interview about the experience of space as an internalized projection, in which kind of like, people go around and they know their left from their right because they kind of produce this kind of internalized space as a projection, and therefore everything feels very familiar to them. And she kind of turns to Alzheimer patients as an example of the opposite of that, in this kind of this losing of left and right, and what she calls the discovering of space as kind of pure externality, and then what she says the great outdoor, what she calls as the great outdoors. So always coming across space not as familiarity, but space as complete and utter new space, I guess. So there's that example, and then the other example that comes to mind is the other one that I mentioned, which is her grandma, which I think is a really strong example, and it comes right at the beginning of her book, The New Wounded. It almost kind of opens with this in the introduction, and this almost Malabou kind of sets out what she wants to do in the book as a kind of reverse of what happened with her grandma, in that it wasn't about getting her grandma home to experience space as familiarity and to experience external surroundings as surroundings that she knew and felt comfortable in, but precisely looking towards these surroundings to feel how she was absent from them. So that's the kind of the thing that that's a reversal that she performs there, that she wants to have these familiar surroundings help her grandma to realize the ways in which she's changed and the ways in which she's absent. Apart from that, I think I'll have to think about that a bit more for a specific engagement with how Malabou thinks about how Alzheimer's subjects engage with their external surroundings. A lot of Malabou's another one just came to mind, actually. She also talks in The New Wounded about Iris Murdoch and Iris Murdoch's own kind of neural transformation at the end of her life, and how this is described by her partner. And apparently at the end of her life, she this biography kind of details how she was entering into a kind of second childhood, and how she was watching Teletubbies on the TV, for example, and she talks about how she'd entered a childhood, but a childhood that was not her own. So she wasn't remembering a childhood; she was entering a completely new created childhood. So that's but apart from this, I guess especially in her kind of second book on the brain, Ontology of the Accident, Ontologie de l'Accident, she talks about more literary examples of transformation in relation to, and so it kind of departs a bit from the kind of specificity of neurodegenerative illness. And so she talks, for example, about Kafka's, she compares kind of the kind of transformations that go on in the brain to Kafka's Metamorphosis, for example. And she talks about the books of, in terms of aging, she talks about the book of Marguerite Duras, The Lover, L'Amant, and how Duras, she opens the book by saying, I aged, how she aged very suddenly. She was just overnight, she randomly became an old woman or something like this. She starts the book. And so Malabou is interested in how that's kind of not a kind of Bildungsroman, linear progression of aging, but a very a kind of, as he calls it, kind of like an ontological invention out of nowhere, this aging that comes out of nowhere. But I'll have to reread that, actually, think about this question of physical space, and the physical environment, and kind of other ways in which Malabou engages with that, because I'm sure it's there. That's a really good question. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Ben. Thank you for the questions, everyone. Thank you for that brilliant answer. So we have another question here. Well, it opens with a thank you for the wonderful talks, and then it seems that both interventions were about an experience of enclosure and exile. I was wondering about the role of bodily decay, so brackets, if we think of the brain as matter, and the sense of finitude in the context of the quest narrative. So I don't know if either of you sort of have any thoughts about that or responses.
I'm happy to go first if you like, Ben. Yeah, I'm nodding. Yeah, so firstly, thank you for your question. It's Kellyanne, I think. The images of decay are through this idea of corruption, this sense of invasion and uncontrollability that the narrator describes in Voix and Crise, looking at. And I found it interesting how it was the nervous system, the nerves that had been controlled. So very much this idea of feeling, reaction, lack of reaction are all kind of controlled by this mysterious organization. And certainly in the other writers that I look at in my thesis, there are these, again, very bodily, graphic, quite horror-based or gothic descriptions of brains being infected by contagion, virus, it's on the nose, or kind of this idea of like rot and contamination, which is frequently linked to like morality. So this idea that there's something wrong with them, quote unquote, or there's this, or like genetic inheritance that has made them, ineffably, irrevocably kind of corrupted. So these bodily images are definitely there, and I think a big a big argument in my thesis is the fact that they use, particularly Lay as well, like they use these kind of like bodily images and quite visceral, in your face, shocking images, precisely for that reason, to shock, and also to give a kind of a narrative kind of aesthetic and imaginable kind of like locus, because as we all know, like trying to pin down, I mean, it's an impossible task of trying to pin down what an individual's personal case or personal kind of experience with mental illness, or experiences might be with mental illness, are often there are nebulous symptoms that come and go. It can often be quite a tricky process in diagnosing, if they want to diagnose at all. So it's very much a writerly strategy to make mental illness more tangible in a way. Not that it has to be, but certainly I think there is a kind of a sort of a socio-political and medical commentary underpinning these heavy, like intense bodily images, trying to make it more real, I suppose, for and more locatable for the readers, and trying to make them understand that while we might talk about psychological suffering and trying to pin down the terminology can be tricky, but or talking about mental illness as this image of like I said, like this kind of like intangibility, something in the something that is not necessarily physical, and it's often theorized or considered as such, particularly in popular culture. So trying to emphasize the bodily makes it more legitimate in a way. I think it's a legitimizing move. And in terms of finitude, it's a complex one again, with this idea with these descriptions or evocations of mental illness, because it's not kind of it's not sorry, it's my dad yelling at the dog. Great. There's it's not kind of, I guess, it's not the same kind of issue or etiology in contrast to, say, the mental illnesses or brain injuries that Ben's looking at, because a lot of the descriptions are, I imagine, like descriptions or psychosomatic in a way. So it's tricky to kind of think about it in relation to decay and finitude, because it's not the same kind of, it's often, not in all cases, but the illnesses that I'm looking at in my thesis don't have that kind of kind of deterioration that the brain injuries that Ben talks about does. But one thing that I'm interested in is the jump from, or like the link between the mental illnesses that are described by the autofictional narrators in the works that I'm looking at, and suicidal ideation and suicide, and how the writers kind of establish suicide as a sort of that finitude in a way. And it can often be in the quest narrative, even though the quest narrative is ultimately hopeful, and looking at the kind of problematic relationship my authors have with suicide as not a kind of, as simultaneously a form of resigning and kind of inevitability, but also as a sort of salutary gesture in a way, and looking at the valorization of suicide as a finitude and as a sort of emancipated choice to make, which is something that, particularly like Nellie Alcon in my thesis, she looks at a lot. So I think that would be the finitude that is kind of danced around a bit, and or is kind of nuanced in Lay particularly, and also in Alcon. But yeah, it's obviously like a very kind of like tricky, kind of like problematic ethical kind of analysis can ensue looking at that representation in their works.
Yeah, I think while Becky was talking about this intangible, how to think decay in terms of intangibility, Malabou's work kind of suggests a complete contrast in which that I think her philosophy describes a world that's very kind of tangible and very material. The question of decay is really interesting, actually, because I almost feel like it's the opposite in Malabou's work, in that the whole violence of a lot of these things is that plastic forms often don't decay, and a lot of these examples of kind of people that have survived past the accident are almost kind of examples of people that have accidentally survived, or I don't know, the violence of them having transformed so much is precisely the violence. Like, if you go back to her engagement with Kafka and the Metamorphosis, it's kind of, Gregor wakes up and he's been transformed into this beetle, and it's a very like violent moment that he's kind of accidentally survived past this accident, and then kind of, if you think back to a kind of another type of plastic, and something that comes up in her work every now and then is, in terms of the actual synthetic plastic, the problem with plastic is on an environmental, ecological level, is that it doesn't decay. It stays there in the ground, and the trash vortex in the Pacific Ocean, for example, is not going to decay anytime soon. And so I think that's also kind of like a kind of a way in which decay almost isn't, or in her work, or is different in her work, in the way I read it anyway. And I think her work moves away from the question of decay and the question of fragment, and stays on the question of form. She always insists that if a plastic form has blown up or whatever, it doesn't kind of blow up into fragments or decayed sections. It blows up into a new form, and she insists that this is a form. So I think if we were talking about decay or a fragment, it would always be a form of decay or a form of fragment, something that kind of persists, and because it persists and kind of insists upon the form of itself, it has to be read and taken seriously in that respect. Yeah, so I think it's almost the opposite in terms of decay, in my reading.
Thank you both so much. I'm sorry I nearly interrupted you then, Ben. I was going to lend into you, but you dived straight in, so it's all great. Then the next question is also for Rebecca. How strong is the correlation between the Vietnam trauma suffered by the narrator and her experience in the psychiatric hospital? Can the hospital work as a metaphor for the political situation in Vietnam?
It's a tricky one, talking about talking about parallelisms, or parallels, that'd be easier to say, parallels between sorry, my dog is just like having a moment right now. It's a tricky one to talk about the parallels between Leigh's autobiographical experiences of Vietnam and what's represented in her books, because in terms of the kind of her kind of vantage point in terms of autofiction becomes quite complex there, because in interviews she's talked about how she kind of doesn't want there to be and sort of denies to certain extents like the parallels between Vietnam and what she describes in her books. I mean, I can only I'd argue that obviously it's autofictional. It's based on her personal experiences, and all of her, and not all, but a lot of her books deal with these questions of exile. But what's interesting about her, kind of, I'll bring in one of her other books that she's written. So this is non-fiction, talking about writing of others and her status as a writer. It's called Le Complexe du Caliban, and she talks about how post-colonial writers in a way become this kind of this Caliban figure in a way, and can and it sort of can be a reductive position for the writer. So I feel like there's a desire to make her works, and you can certainly see this, and I see this, reading them and studying them for my thesis, and interestingly all the other women autofiction writers in my thesis have the same issue in terms of media response, or like interviews, or reading reader responses, is this kind of and we see it all the time, in particularly in women's life writing more broadly, this like shrinking down to the individual and the particular, and denying any kind of universality, and that's kind of part of a broader kind of reception issue, and how we view female experience. But to bring it back to Leigh, I feel like there is definitely a desire not to be reduced to that shelf that they have in the French bookshops where it says Vietnam, or like Southeast Asia, and then it has all of the writers there as if she's not French and she's not writing in French. And so there is this, I feel like there is a potentially a desire to reference and use these kind of autobiographical points, and these talking about trauma and exile, and definitely how it contributes to the sense of alienation from the self, leading to psychological kind of like suffering and potential disturbance, particularly with this issue with her father dying, and the grief of that triggering this kind of this extended period of 2 years, but at the same time, from like I imagine from this authorial point of view, not wanting to make it so easy for the readers to make her so specific, when in actuality she is talking about universal, recognizable and necessary, politically necessary themes and topics to address. So I think that kind of, to go back to your kind of like your question, this the kind of the sort of hauntology of Vietnam and her work is like a very kind of like interesting one to think about, both in terms of narrative and aesthetics, but also in terms of the extra textual reasons that I just said, like her position as an author and how her work is received. And I'm not sure about the hospital working as a metaphor for the political situation of Vietnam. I'd have to like do more research on that, but it definitely seems plausible given the way that Vietnam refracts through all of her work.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Becky. I've got another question for you here. I'm just going to fire them at you. So returning to the idea of power dynamics that was brought up earlier, is this also gendered? So are the doctors all men in these texts, or is it more in terms of sort of a doctor-patient power dynamic?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think so the doctors mentioned briefly, like as the psychiatre as like the grand inquisiteur, like the great inquisitors. There's no gender there, but I'd in terms of the French, I can take like a free interpretation there. What's interesting actually in the opening kind of the opening hospital scene is that there's a female nurse, and the way that she's number one, that's already like a gendered representation of like the caring role in quite a difficult space, is, kind of resorts to, well, it's a woman doing the caring role, but also she's represented as silent. So again, like this idea of kind of docility, and also I noticed something when I was rereading it, she's described in the both times as wearing this like all blue uniform. So it was this kind of I feel like a almost like a gendered sort of stereotype of this very like old-fashioned traditional image of a nurse wearing this like kind of pristine uniform. And yeah, to bring in like a rather silly pop culture reference, there's a Netflix adaptation, well, not adaptation, but like kind of extended series about Nurse Ratched, or like the early years of Nurse Ratched from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and the nurses are all wearing these like 1940s, 1950s perfect blue outfits. And it just, when I was reading the lay again, it kind of just struck me about this kind of very kind of like prim, proper gendered representation of the nurse, and then to contrast that, you have these kind of sort of like demonic and obviously male patriarchal inquisitors come psychiatrists. So I think there's definitely a gendered aspect there, but again, lay extra-textually in relation to kind of like gender and like classifying her writing as like contemporary women's writing, that's another kind of like issue to unpick, for the same reasons that she doesn't necessarily want to be identified as like a Vietnamese writer or a post-colonial writer. It's that same thing of not being, and again, that very kind of like French response of not wanting to be identified as like auteur with an E on the end. So it's that, so the kind of exploring the kind of like gendered aspects becomes complicated due to the particular kind of, culture and society she's operating in as a writer.
Thank you so much, Becky. That actually made me think of, just as a side comment, that in Silmani's Chanson Douce, she's dressed, the nanny who's, this caregiver, she's dressed in blue. And it's interesting that blue is this colour that is stereotyped in sort of contemporary works for this sort of caregiving woman. Going to dive straight back in for a question for you as well. Going back to your engagement with Arthur Frank and therapeutic force of narrative and storytelling in healthcare, what is meant exactly by therapeutic here? Do you think in Frank's theory of the wounded storyteller there is an element of embracing or letting be the kinds of self-strangeness and transformation that Malabou describes?
Yeah, I like that. I like listening to your paper, because I think it that idea of the letting go with the chaos narrative can potentially be and again, this relates to kind of like the complicated, kind of like tangled, nuanced representations of mental illness, madness, and suicide, particularly in Lay's work. This kind of in other, again, non-fiction work, she's sort of valorized and even hyper-valorized like quote unquote like mad writers, going back to these stereotypes of like, exalted, literary production or what have you from certain states of mind. So I feel like, but to make it, I feel like the Malabou is more nuanced in the kind of the coming undone can be a kind of, and the letting go can be a kind of a freedom, particularly from sort of biopolitical structures or like traditional therapies and traditional narratives. And I feel like that could be like a contemporary update of the chaos narrative. It's not just, doom and gloom as Frank describes, or, lack of hope. It can potentially be there can potentially be something freeing in that kind of freeing in the by removing yourself from that certain space. So I think the Malabou would work well with the Frank there. And then the idea of the therapeutic force of narrative and storytelling in healthcare. Out of all the illness narrative theorists I've looked at, I prefer Frank's kind of theorizations, because they're very much focused on the patient and patient ownership, and this idea of reclaiming, because there is this notion that you have to claim something back, whereas a lot of other illness narrative theorists, so for say the main one would be Arthur Kleinman, his kind of conception of illness narratives is, in terms of therapeutic, is very much within the therapeutic encounter and within this set power structure, as in how medical, epistemology is created, is basically, yes, he acknowledges the importance of the patient illness narrative, but it's purely to fill in the gaps of the doctor's narrative. And he even goes as far, I think he says, I can't quote this exactly, but it's roughly, he says the job of the doctor is to like translate the patient's rhetoric, which I found so, I mean, I know he's trying to valorize the patient experience, and this book was written in 1988, so it's still, you know, valuable, but again, it's this idea that the patient corresponds and fits into you, or rather it's the doctor who claims and kind of like molds it, plasticity, molds it into this kind of set idea of what therapeutic is. So Frank, goes further than that and is better, but like you say, I think after listening to your paper, like, you can reframe the chaos narrative as potentially something positive, freeing.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Becky. Just a comment here for you, actually, from Catherine on Blue, saying it's strongly linked to depictions of Mary, which is a really good point. So connotations with this pure, perfect mother figure. So thank you for that. And I've got another maybe final question for Ben, if that's okay, and everyone's still hanging in there. So for Ben, this person was struck by the emphasis on memory as asking the patient to remember, who are you? Also seems to me that this question from family members is, do you remember who I am to you, brackets. I wonder if one could say that Malabou is suggesting that in order for clinical space to be truly hospitable, non-patients have to embrace a certain absence to themselves as well. And what does that look like? It's a really fascinating question.
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you so much. I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I think that is definitely such an important part of this project and this research going forward, and kind of what was said a bit earlier about, I don't know, how the hospital might be, able to kind of harbour all of these kind of different, not just the patient, but also the transformations that need to go on in the family around the patient, etc. I think for me, and this is something that I argued in my thesis on Malabou as well, is that the idea that someone reading or witnessing plasticity themselves has to necessarily then transform in themselves is central to her work. And I think before she started talking about science and the brain and this kind of stuff, in her very first book, L'avenir de Hegel, she talks about what is the role of the philosopher and what is the role of the reader. And she talks about la lectrice and la lectrice of plasticity. And I think central to her argument there is that la lectrice has to change and has to accept to change whilst looking at plasticity. Like, so she, for example, Malabou as the philosopher of plasticity has to also accept to change in relation to her work on plasticity. So I think that is very pertinent here in the clinical setting, and that will definitely be part of my research, the ways in which these architectures and the kind of clinical encounter has to kind of entail the family also accepting to change with their loved one. I mean, I definitely have kind of personal experience of this. My grandpa is currently going through quite a lot of changes, neurological changes, and I think kind of when we're together, we have like a really nice time, but we do kind of, everyone accepts to be slightly different as well, like that we kind of talk about stories that kind of didn't really happen, and kind of memories that have transformed a lot, and this kind of thing. And it's kind of like, he's very himself in having transformed in a weird way. And there's kind of like it was hard at first, but then there's kind of, I don't know, I can see that we've all kind of accepted to kind of go with it, which is quite nice in a way. And I think for me personally, I've experienced that there's a definite intimacy in that, and I still feel very close to my grandpa in this kind of mutual transformation of us both. So yeah, that's a really brilliant question. I'll have to think a lot more about that, but it'll definitely be central to this research going forward, I think.
I want to take this moment to thank both our fantastic speakers on their brilliant papers, and thank everybody that has participated and attended this first fantastic seminar as part of a really brilliant series. I'm going to hand it over now. This is the big handover to Rebecca and Benjamin to promote your next seminar. Thank you both so much.
Thank you both for joining, dragging you back in. to moderate and lead this seminar. It's been really helpful, so thank you so much for doing this. Right, Ben, shall I do the first little bit, the date, and then do you want to do the names? Sure. Okay. So as has been said, we've got, and I think the full program will be going out soon. We have a whole series of Women in Medical Humanities seminars coming up. We have 13 in total, so you've done one already, 12 more to go, but they will be spaced out over this term and then going up into March 2021, with the aim of also doing like another big conference later in 2021, potentially virtual, who knows. But anyway, seminar 2 is coming up, so it's fortnightly, every Tuesday at the same time. So it will be, the title is Feminizing Illness and yeah, I got that right. Yeah, Feminizing Illness and Medicine: Narrative Methods, Forms, and Aesthetics, and it's on Tuesday, the 6th of October, 5:30 to 7 p.m. BST. And the Zoom details and like the IMLR invite will be going out soon via social media and via the IMLR, and Francophile then will try and get it out and, you know, cast the net wide as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Becky. So the papers that we'll be having next week are from Marie Alit and Diana Andrea Novasanu. So Marie will be talking about containers, cuts, and chronotopes, writing time and space in women's pathographies, and Diana Andrea will be talking about a world of one's own, women's depictions of clinical spaces in contemporary visual arts. So yeah, really looking forward to seeing you all there, hopefully. Definitely make sure to sign up. And thank you so much to Jessica and Jemima again for chairing our first session.